Welcome to APG Pathshala. Today we are going to discuss the module Husserl's Phenomenological Epistemology in the paper Epistemology 1, and this module is written by C.B. George of IIT Bombay. I am Raghuram Raju from University of Hyderabad. One of the important aspects of phenomenology is it is a movement. It's considered as phenomenological movement. Many philosophies are called as isms: idealism, empiricism, rationalism, materialism, and so on. This is the only, perhaps, the philosophy that has this characterization, which is it is a movement. Now, I think there's something very interesting about this, considering it as a movement, because it takes on a very big civilizational issue on it. So there are two aspects to phenomenology. One is the civilizational task it seems to take on itself, on its shoulders, so to say. The other one is the technical aspects, which is bracketing, Dasein, then phenomenological reduction and intentionality, and so on. We will try to cover both in this module. Now, in order to understand the civilizational aspect or task of phenomenological movement, and with particular reference to Husserl, Edmund Husserl, is to recall that two important tasks of modernity were instituting the centrality of individual, human being at the center, and also bring rationality to the center stage of philosophical thinking. So, human centrality and rationality are two pillars, basic pillars of varying importance that constitutes the project of modernity. Now, Descartes postulated the centrality of I, where he said the I is important. I think, therefore I am. Kant made the entire knowledge dependent on the self. And then you have empiricists like Locke, Berkeley, and Hume, who also looked at the centrality of experience. Notwithstanding all these things, there was a tendency to take objectivism more seriously, and that seriousness got coupled with the advances in science, which are more towards objectivism, rationality, progress, matter, and things like that. Now, these two streams, the centrality of human existence and the rationality of the discourse, got a slightly disproportionate recognition, so to say, where you have more development on the side of rationality, on the side of objectivism, along with the developments in natural sciences, and less in the domain of human centrality. Now, in fact, one could also see that slowly the developments in both philosophy and science were slowly eroding the centrality of human being, and that was of a great concern for philosophers. So it made people to ask, what was the major project of modernity? Was it to achieve objectivism, or was it to bring centrality to human existence? And the answer, if the answer, and rightly answer should be the centrality of human existence, but the results show the contrary. In fact, the human centrality got eroded over a period of time. And this is what is seen by the phenomenological movement. The phenomenological movement particularly Husserl, saw this tension between centrality of human existence and developments in natural sciences. And in his later work, I mean perhaps the last work, entitled The Crisis in European Sciences, he sees that the elimination of the subject or erosion of the significance of subject consists the crisis in European sciences. So, if you look at this background, there you have a huge task that phenomenology seeks to undertake. And as a first step, phenomenology undertook the task of bringing the self back. There is an imminent urgency to bring self back, and this is what required a movement. That's why it's called a phenomenological movement. Perhaps why it's called a phenomenological movement is this underlying civilizational task it seems to be taking on its shoulders. So the immediate problem before Husserl, as a background to bring the self back into the center stable of philosophy, is the Kantian problem. Kant came up with the distinction between appearance and reality, or the technical phrase for this is the noumena and phenomena. The noumena and phenomena has become such a serious problem for the subsequent people. They thought that how is noumena different from theological concepts like God? Okay, if noumena is there, how do we access it? And in Kant, as you know, you can't access noumena. Noumena is something that you can only infer. All that you have is appearance. Now, Husserl rejected this Kantian distinction between noumena and phenomena. Following Brentano, who claimed that consciousness is always consciousness of something, he said that there is no need to accept noumena which is not given to as experience. So in taking on this a Kantian problem and rejecting the distinction between noumena and phenomena, he comes up with his own package where both the object and consciousness, or the subject and the matter, are closely imbricated. Okay, so this brought self to the center stage. But what Husserl talks about is not just the self in the technical terminology or in his writings. What Husserl talks is the consciousness. The self has a consciousness, and he now embarks on developing a methodology which is called phenomenological method. And here he follows Brentano, and Husserl tries to study the intentional structures of consciousness from the first person, and yet these structures are generalizable. So there is a first person, the self, and there is a consciousness of the first person, and this consciousness has a structure, and this consciousness can be generalized. So these are the various things that are there. So as I said, that it is through this package or through this relation, he tries to ensure both subjectivism and objectivism, and where both are imbricated. Yet another important aspect in Husserl's phenomenology is intentionality. Intentionality for Husserl is an important core aspect of consciousness. Consciousness for Husserl is not passive. It is intentional. So there is a willing, there is an intention. Intentionality is not specific and narrow. It's a broad, a theme, broad aspect in Husserl. Intentionality in that sense has an extended sense in Husserl. So intentionality in Husserl can take the form of several forms. such as perception, recollection, expectations, beliefs, wish, doubt, thought, fantasy, imagination, hallucination. The major task of phenomenology is to properly and philosophically describe the intentional structure of consciousness. In undertaking this task, that is, Husserl's phenomenology rejected both science and common sense. Science, according to Husserl, does not bother about the subject and consciousness and presents a world view without self. They think as if that there is a world and we are just understanding the world. This, according to Husserl, is a distortion. It is a distortion because one cannot have the objective world without consciousness. Though consciousness is what performs everything, the scientists, however, are not aware of or pretend as if consciousness plays no role. This, according to Husserl, is both distorting and misleading. Similarly, he also rejects the common sense view of the external world. He finds it too naive because it takes what is given in consciousness passively and it takes it for granted, and that it doesn't ask what are the things that are given in consciousness and how are what are given in consciousness are constituted. In contrast, phenomenology asks this question and asks it, saying that what are the things that are given to us in consciousness. To recollect this discussion so far, Husserl rejects the Kantian distinction between phenomenon and nomenon. He rejects science as it does not factor self and consciousness. He rejects common sense for taking what is given in consciousness passively. So according to Husserl, the intentional character of consciousness is the transcendental condition for the possibility of knowledge. That is the crux of Husserl's phenomenology. To repeat again, the intentional character of consciousness is the transcendental condition for the possibility of knowledge. So intentionality is primarily in consciousness, and it is this that provides transcendental condition for the possibility of knowledge. As I already pointed out, it is in this sense intentionality plays a very dominant and important role in Husserl's phenomenology. Unlike Kantian noumena, Husserl does not leave anything outside the purview of consciousness. Nothing lies outside the purview of consciousness. Everything is given to consciousness. Objects cannot be reached except through consciousness. Husserl looks at the acts of consciousness which alone give us object of knowledge. So this givenness to consciousness is direct and unmediated. That is, the givenness to consciousness is direct and unmediated. The givenness to consciousness would mean that intentional object is already loaded with meaning. Okay, it is not that there is an object and then we have a meaning. It is already there. Objects are given to consciousness in various ways. That's an important point that we have to keep. It is not that they are given to us in just one way. They are given in various ways, as desiring, as fear, as imagination, as several other things. But the intentional consciousness is not homogeneous. There is a qualitative difference between various pieces of intentional consciousness. This is what he calls as quality of experience. Okay? He also talks about the other important thing, which is matter of experience. That is, objects as such that consciousness intends is called matter of experience. So matter of experience further have two modes of givenness. One is intuitive, the other one is signative. Intuitive is those things, those objects that are in front of us, and they can be seen because they are in front of us. But he also talks about seeing an object in a photograph, and seeing an object in a photograph is same as seeing an object that is in front of us. Signative, on the other hand, is about objects that are not in front of us. So signative also are of varying types. They can appear in imagination, they can appear in fantasy, they can appear in hallucination. Imagining an object is not imagining a different object that was intuited. That is, imagining an object is not different from intuiting an object. What it is one and the same object given to my consciousness in different modes. So intuiting an object is not different from imagining an object. The object in both the cases is same, except that the object that is same is given to my consciousness in different modes. The Husserl seeks to overcome the conscious separation of noumena and phenomena by bringing consciousness into the center stage. And the consciousness is not mere subjective thing, as it has structures and it has a transcendental character. Since what is given to consciousness is direct and unmediated, he rejects representational theory of knowledge. Representational theory of knowledge will have a lot of things that mediate, that there is an object and I represent that object. So I am a mediator between the object and the way in which it is represented. So there is something, I play a role between object and how it is represented. It has a lot of, a lot of it is discussed in philosophy, and also a lot of it is discussed in post-colonialism subsequently. Okay, so this representational theory of knowledge is not acceptable to him, because that representational theory leaves many things unanswered. For instance, it will say, is the object outside my representation? Okay, or on the other point that representational theory faces is, are representation equivalent to object? Is there anything called object, or all that we have is representation? If everything is representational, then how does one calibrate, how does one compare, how does one evaluate one representation from other representation? So that can lead to hermeneutical violence, which is a big discussion in later hermeneutic philosophy and deconstruction. So he doesn't accept the representational theory of knowledge. For him, knowledge does not represent. It is not merely subjective either. Because if it is merely subjective, then there is a problem that it is just subjective. If it is subjective, then there is a problem that it is merely solipsistic. And if it is solipsistic, then it cannot avoid being nihilistic. So that extreme subjectivism is avoided by Husserl by making it dependent on the intentionality, is dependent on the structures of consciousness. So, and also it is not merely an objectivity of knowledge as in science, where the other extreme is that the subject is not factored, subject is ignored, subject is not taken into serious consideration because we think that objective reality is independent of the subject. So Husserl is proposing a transcendental phenomenology that is not just reporting the phenomena. It is not what happens in the case of objectivist or in the case of some empiricist. It is just not highlighting subject that relapses into solipsism, as just mentioned, or made dependent on God, like in Berkeley. What Husserl proposes is a systematic method, a phenomenological bracketing that makes sure that mere subject or contingent cultural aspects are not allowed. They are, in fact, kept outside. This is to ensure through phenomenological reduction and bracketing, so that one is given the pure objectivity, pure consciousness. This ensures that natural attitudes are bracketed and objects are presented to consciousness in a pure form and in an unmediated way. So this is the major project of this moment called Phenomenological Moment. As I said, that it has taken a colossal task, a civilizational task on its shoulder to bring subject back, and it embarks on this project in a massive way. Let us also look at how it impacted on the future trends. For instance, it has one of the important influences on existentialism comes from phenomenology. The hermeneutic tradition also has its genesis in the phenomenological movement. The entire post-structuralism owes its inspiration and resources to phenomenology. But the one thing that really stood out in many philosophical systems later is the idea of intentionality. It came again and again in 20th century philosophy, not only within phenomenology, not only in the continental tradition, it also has its place in Anglo-Saxon philosophical traditions. It's clear from this that Husserl's phenomenology has embarked on a massive task and tries to accomplish it as much as possible. And it also remained a large impact on subsequent schools of philosophy. Thank you.